respecting where you're at in the process. So as we build metrics for the business, as the data team, you usually start with an all-in metric. I mean, most people do, right? What is our customer lifetime value? And then you start to segment it. Well, what is it for our new customers? What is it for people who are part of this campaign? How does it trend? How does it compare? Is that even the right metric? Is that actually just a downstream metric of something different? And that's the thing, but that thing's harder to get at, like sentiment or, brand engagement or something like that.
Thank you, Jolie, for just joining us here today. We're just so excited to have you. And we just wanted to, per our previous conversation, you had me super intrigued on you talking about the very topic that I'm actually trying to author a book on, which is having a value-centric data team. And so I'd love to just kind of have you elucidate for the listeners the very things that you and I were just synergistically going off on with one another. So maybe if you wouldn't mind just kind of talking about how you're defining value and how you implement that within your data team to make it value centric.
Yeah, happy to. First of all, I would say it's hard. It's hard work. It's a long journey. If you work in a company where, data is sitting within, potentially technology, and your customers are mainly internal customers, and it's not really directly tying to direct monetization, there may not be a lot of pressure to be super value driven. And it may be harder to sort of get those metrics. And that has certainly been my experience. We really don't want either the data team or IT to be seen as a cost center within the organization.
Right.
You may not be directly, driving revenue, but we want to be able to show the value that we're creating so that we can continue to, gain talent, attract talent, and have, significant contributions to the business. So, that's really where it's really important. I would say in terms of different ways that we've sort of done that on the journey. It really is, number one, having and establishing partnerships with our business partners, whatever you want to call them, customers, stakeholders, the people who we end up working with. I think it really starts there. You can't really deliver value without forming really, really, really close relationships. And so that's really where we start.
Right. So it's interfacing with the business to identify where the greatest opportunities could occur. And I agree, the business partners are going to be the fulcrum upon which you determine and assess the value, right? So if it's done in such a way where it's a vacuum where you just go and you just say, oh, I think this business process should be going this way, and I'm going to curate a bunch of queries to prove that this is true, you're just going to go nowhere. So you have to identify with the business, hey, I think one of the big questions I like to ask is if you had a magic wand and you can just say I wanted to just change the whole way things can go to where we create the greatest value for the organization, what would that magic wand do? And then being able to quantify that. So how have you personally been able to quantify things that you mentioned may not be the revenue increaser? What are some things you've done to kind of use as a tool to say, hey, this is how we determine the value of this initiative?
Yeah, I've used a few different methodologies. I think that there are some that are very, maybe not very complex, but I've seen very complex versions of them, like WSJF score, where you say, super agile, wait as shortest job first, and you're really putting a lot of discipline into the user stories that you are creating. Who's going to use this? What value is it going to have? And you're rating it on these dimensions of value that are multidimensional, such as revenue, potential, compliance, or risk reduction, and, giving it scores, and you're doing estimation and sizing to figure out how big it is, and you're negotiating to get the best ratio of those things by making it smaller and smaller to deliver the same amount of value. So, I've worked in organizations that had a lot of rigor like that. And then I've also worked in organizations that is a little bit too complex. And when I say organizations, it might even just be the teams within the same place and where that team is at and where they need to be. And so, in some cases, there's actually a fun activity that I learned from somebody who I worked with around the size component, but you can do it on the value component too, where you take a bunch of pictures of dogs And it is which is the how much effort goes into grooming this dog. So that's how it could go on the effort side. You could use it on the value side to sort of do the same thing. But you find these relative things that people understand that aren't the work, that could express value or could express effort. And you say, is it more like this or is it more like this? And honestly, that's a really good way when you do it on the effort size, whether you're doing a t-shirt size or a weird dog activity or something like that, to say, is it more like this biggest thing we've ever done or is it more like the smallest thing? And once you can have that conversation, then you can start to dive into more and more of the details. Because as challenging as it is for us sometimes on the data side to say, well, here's the value that we're going to deliver, is also sometimes challenging on the business side to say, I know I'm going to deliver this much value. Sometimes there's I know this is going to make a difference, but when people are pressed to put a very finite number to it, it tends to be a little scary. Is it $50,000? Is it 150? And so
Right.
it's a different way to kind of have that. You have to find creative ways to have that conversation to start it.
Yeah, so you're automatically sizing up each initiative with that environment using either that dog analogy or t-shirt sizing and saying, hey, look, on complexity scale or effort level, how much of this is a pain, right? How difficult is this? If this problem is alleviated or solved, then you have that opportunity to ask the preceding and follow-up questions. Is that right?
Yeah, yep, exactly. And that's really, the holy grail. I would say sometimes we come closer to perfection in it than others, but not having that conversation is a guaranteed way to just work on whatever somebody yells the loudest about, right?
Right.
So, if you don't even build that into your process, you're sort of behind the eight ball, from the beginning.
Right. Yeah. If you're just sitting there taking ad hoc requests, you're kind of at a maturity scale in your data team of 0, right?
Right.
That means that you have not actually communicated the value of the initiatives that you're working on. And that also means that the leadership of the team or the executive leadership or the leadership over that data team is not supportive of your initiatives, right?
Right.
So you're at the 0 spectrum. So moving along that spectrum is baseline level, like being able to push back and saying, hey, what's the actual value proposition at the end of the day? If we complete this and we spend 3 weeks of some of our most valuable resources to resolve this issue, and that issue solves 4 hours a week of one of your employees' work, that's not a value add, right? Like you got to think about like what was that cost
Right.
of your most valuable resource for 3 weeks working on something that resolved like a 4 hour task. That's just worthless, right?
Exactly.
Versus something where you're like, oh, like this 3 weeks worth of work reduced this workload for an entire department of 50 people by 25%.
Right.
Now it's like, okay, that is substantive, right? So now you can kind of say, okay, what are the things they now work on because that's been solved? So like, if you've run into this, is I usually like to ask the question is like, if we solve this, what then will your team work on in its absence? And then using that to communicate the value.
I love
Because we're doing this department can now do these tasks,
to do these
which
other things.
deliver this value, right? And so in that, you can also like use the business to kind of like champion yourself by saying, hey, look what Jolie has done here, even though you helped kind of build the technical aspects, they built the roadwork for like here's how the process should change or here's how the reporting or analytics or whatever occurred. You can champion it and say, hey, Jolie did all this work, right? And then they can come back and be like, oh no, the data team did that, and you're like,
Yeah.
well, it was a partnership. And so when you present those values, one of the biggest pushbacks I've seen, and maybe this is like what I'd like to talk to you about, is how do you deal with the pushbacks of, oh, you didn't create that much value, the organization, well, the sales team or the accounting team or the finance team or such and such other team, the manufacturing operations team was the one who delivered that value. It wasn't your data team. It wasn't your BI team. It wasn't whomever. How do you deal with objections when you present the value and it's received kind of like with yeah, you're giving yourself more credit than you do.
I think that there's, I think two things come to mind. One was actually something that that was talked about the weekend that you and I met for the first time, which was, if you're HR and you are trying to measure how well you're building a talent pipeline, you have some metrics such as what were their performance reviews their first year, how long did they stay at the company. You could probably come up with a bunch. That's not only HR or it's not only recruiting. The manager has something to do with that. The role fit has something to do with that. But and so if you really look at it, it's hard for any one department to say that they did anything in isolation. If you really peel it back, sales can't really say it was all them. Marketing can
Right.
definitely not say that it's all them. People spend millions of dollars on attribution. So it's really no different for IT.
Right.
I think that because we're so analytical in data, we want it to be really precise, but no one's more equipped to be able to sort of analyze the information than data, as long as we don't take it too literally. You know what I mean? So you can build models, or sort of estimates, and you walk through the thought process of kind of templatizing, like, how do we prove value than just filling in the blanks, right? So like, if you're not talking about the specific thing, but you're like, hours of work might be a template, or, like you said, what would you do instead? Then you just have to fill in the right values, and you get, an estimate. You say, does that seem right? I would also say that, in terms of experience, validating that with the group that you're doing it with is really important. You don't want to put together the estimate and then say, go out and maybe something was wildly wrong.
Yeah.
But you also have to do it. So, and making that a win to tell together, right? Like, hey, this was because of our partnership that this
Exactly.
happened. So it looks good on both of us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think you hit the nail on the head, which is I kind of had this notion that a thing that I could say is that data teams have a very difficult time, or they do a very great job of presenting reality, right? They want to be very precise because half the time they're doing financial analytics or something to do that needs to be zeroed in with a margin of error that's something close to nothing, right? And so they're
Yeah,
very used to being very meticulous, almost like accountants. It has to be dead to nuts right. And so they like presenting reality versus like a sales team likes to present a vision, right? It's like, this is where we're going. This is what we're doing. Here's the value you can do. And so this idea that when you communicate value from your department that you're delivering, it needs to be in the more sales side of like, this is the vision, and the preciseness doesn't need to be exact. You are not putting this on a 10K or whatever that may be. Like, it needs to be to the level where you are just informing your leadership, hey, this initiative cultivated this value on these metrics, right? So it increased employee retention by X. It whatever those metrics may be, it's communicating that value, and it doesn't have to be to a fiduciary like standard of excellence. If that
exactly.
makes sense. And I think you just pointed that out so succinctly.
Yeah. And I think that there's also like respecting where you're at in the process. So as we build metrics for the business, as the data team, you usually start with an all-in metric. I mean, most people do, right? What is our customer lifetime value? And then you start to
Right,
segment it. Well, what is it for our new customers? What is it for people who are part of this campaign? How does it trend? How does it compare? Is that even the right metric? Is that actually just a downstream metric of something different? And that's the thing, but that thing's harder to get at, like sentiment or, brand engagement
right,
or something like that. And so you do your best with what you have. And so I think that, it's okay to start with the number of views that a report got, even if it's somewhat flawed, even if your best report might only be seen by one person and that person has a lot of decision making power. And another report might have somebody clicking on it every day, but it has less, that's fine. Start with the clicks. It gives you a piece of information. And as you work, then you just figure out, how do I get the next thing? How do I get the next thing? So, really, if I could just sum it up, it's like, start someplace, because don't, be, I don't know, what's the word? Don't just stop there, but, it's better than nothing.
Right. And so, what are your thoughts on how much level of effort do you feel is necessary to benchmark your initiatives on the outset so that way when you deliver the value, you're able to communicate? Like, let me give a good example. So, if you were doing a situation where you are providing you're bringing, let's suppose you're a business that does B2B sales, right? Whatever that may be, right? And in that, you find that those businesses that you're doing those transactions with, but you're working with one legal entity, and they have a bunch of sister legal entities, and then ultimately an ultimate parent company, right? So just a standard like subsidiary relationship, right? And you're like, hey, we can do some cross sell, we can do customer penetration, and so you kind of say on the front end, we're going to provide our sales reps and our BDR people with a bunch of we're going to do a bunch of we're going to work with Zoom Info, whoever, right? And you say, okay, we're going to take these new customers, right? And we're going to say, hey, these are some sister legal entities that are likely to presume to purchase the same things or part of the same SIC code. And so you flag them, and then if sales occur, you can turn around and say, hey, look, this initiative of providing them reporting and analytics on those customer penetration, you can then do a very clear, here's the value add as a consequence of this initiative, right?
Yes.
So to that end, like you can go very far from a data perspective, and the ensnarement is like I've seen people make the failure of like you said earlier, some people go way too far into building what is the value into how do you determine that depth of creating a benchmark for the ultimate end state valuation? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, where do we draw the line on like what level of effort is too much and what is too little?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that this is the right answer, but my first answer is it is a function of how expensive and involved that project is to get right. You know what I mean? So, if you're going to be spending a year and hundreds of thousands of dollars and buying a bunch of data and, to sort of solve this thing, you have to spend a bit more time. If you can generate lead flow for your company with data for basically free, and you can do that, then yeah, tag it, put it in your lead flow system with like this came from the data team. It's got its own source, just like if it came from Google, it would have its source,
Right.
and measure it and see how it goes. So I think that is certainly a piece of it, but I do think that the value of just even, if you have data to benchmark against, whether that is, an industry standard or maybe the results of a test that you did or something going into it, that is certainly, like I said, gold standard. But, even if you have some hypotheticals, like, that you can then later validate against, it helps to on the accountability side too, like, because especially if you're doing like a minimum viable product or a proof of concept, if eventually you want every single person in the business to use this thing, but at first you're only going to go out to like 10 or 20, and then you get into the sticky situation of we're still supporting the 10 to 20 but we're not at the 1,000, like kind of holding accountability to like the reason this made sense when it was going to be the whole company, but at 10 to 20 it's not worth it anymore. We have to continue the rollout to like full-fledged, or else maybe that we just have to admit that we should spend these resources someplace else. That's why I think that even if you don't know for sure, just like getting the idea of like what were you expecting helps later, because things are always murkier when you're in the middle of like, what do I do? Do I continue this? Do I not? Whereas up front, when you're doing that business case, they tend to be less emotional and less gray, paradoxically. Most things work the other way, where hindsight's 2020. But I think on business cases, a lot of times the intent
Yep.
feels really clear. And then later you're like, is this good enough? It's somewhere in between the two of what I thought.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. I love that notion of like, and I've put into practice and find it a great discipline to do pilots, saying like, we're gonna do this as a benchmark. does it create the value proposition? And then it helps you create a North Star, right? Like, okay, as we're going down this road, we're doing this because in our pilot it demonstrated this, which takes immense amount of partner collaboration within the organization to make sure that that pilot is done in a very, very like strategic way, if that makes sense. It needs to be a very strategic representation of what the future could hold on an
Right.
initiative like that. I love it. So moving from there, like what are your thoughts on like we had a whole conversation about being aware of like the scale of your data team and it corresponding to your organization and how to
Mhm.
like actually have some actual self-awareness. And I don't know if you remember this conversation. I think it was the last call that we had. Would you mind kind of like if you remember it, just kind of going over what we had talked about? Because I found it super fascinating pieces I really want to come back to you and talk to you about as we put it into the book. But
Yeah, for sure. So I'm trying to remember the exact things we talked about. We talked about like the methodology, the hypothetical scenarios, but I don't know if it was that, you can kind of clue me in. Where my head is kind of going right now when it comes to scale, coming off of the last piece of what we, just ended talking about is, if you're building all of these things and they, based on the value you expect them to provide, and they no longer provide the value that you expect them to provide, but they still run, right? Like this is where you end up with 500 to 1,000 reports that you still need to be maintained when you do a transition from one system to another, but you have to like update all of them even though nobody's really using them anymore, or where you end up with a model that just kind of just runs every night. You are going to not be able to scale. You're not going to be able to keep up with the business at all because you're still saying yes to things that were built 3, 4, 5 years ago. You can't take any more on unless you get more people, and then you get bloat. And so I would say like one of the things is just it is super, super important pretty much on a regular basis to just look at like where where do we need to scale and like what's holding us back a little bit, and what are the things we said yes to at the time that now need to be said no to, right? Not, because I think a lot of people know that like the stuff that comes in, your yes is the most important thing, and there's a lot that you shouldn't do, but I think it's also like out of what you've built, what do you have to go back and clean up? And we have been really looking at our world as what are the things in our portfolio that if we were not an internal team, if we were a company, or that these would be our profit drivers. Those are these big solutions that really drive those major processes in our organization, and those get your full love and attention. Data science is looking at them, BI is looking at them, data engineering is building out all of the data sets to answer the questions. And then everything else, may add value, but not as much. And so we've leaned in pretty heavily to looking at self-service in those areas to be able to say, listen, the 80% of our energy has to go to the 20% of the business that, is driving most of the value. So there's like an 80-20, 80. But
right.
over here, there's still a lot there. And so, you can't abandon any one thing, I guess is what I would say. So you have to modernize your infrastructure. You have to do those big projects. You have to support self-service. And you have to just find like the best way to do all three of those and in measure to each other, right? Like based on what the organization needs, which can be a trick. But I think a lot of people fall into like, well, until we do this, we can't do this, and sort of over index in one place, and it won't wait until you've replatformed to sort of answer that business question. So
Yeah, no, and I think that that's wonderful because there's this whole notion of like this obligation to we have to support you almost have to determine like do you bifurcate your team, right? And saying
right.
these are the people supporting legacy thing, and then now our best talent is going to be focused on these larger initiatives, or kind of pulling a Microsoft and end of lifing things, saying, hey, Windows 10 is no longer supported in November, right? Like, therefore, you guys need to be aware that although this was a critical value for you, You need to understand that it will continue to run if you want, but we won't continue to service it. So, yeah, I love this idea of like focusing on the greatest profitability things. That's the greatest initiative. And then if you're able to do what you were talking about, which is communicating your value up, you get full support, right? Saying, hey, look, like here's the things that we're working on, and here's the value they're going to drive versus here's what it's going to take to continue to support this. You have these 50, 200 report, 1,000 reports, and that's going to require X number of FTEs. Here's your spend on supporting these, right? Is that what you want, right? And then it enables you to actually build the budget that way, right? So you can say, hey, like we're going to bring in a consulting group to end of life these, so that way we can have our core team focused on this. But you can't do that without the value demonstrations that you articulated earlier, right? If they can't see these initiatives are going to say bring about 5 million, 10 million in cost savings, and is going to drive these operational efficiencies, increase revenue or customer retention in these ways, then when you come to ask for, hey, we need two additional people, or we want to do a $500,000 spend on a consulting group to end of life these reports, right? You have no latitude if you can't demonstrate the value. And it's interesting how like the data teams think that they're kind of like every other department has to do it, but data teams just seem to think they're like exempt from it because they're in such high. Everybody wants to reach out to them with their own new request, and so they feel this like everybody needs us sentiment. What are your thoughts on that? Like this whole idea of like you becoming the center of all like problems to be solved, like running in contrast from your ego to working on the highest value. Like, oh, I can service you, and it's gonna feel great for a minute, right? And then you just assume that technical debt, and it drives you away from. What are your thoughts on how to manage that even internally, right?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I would say that, a couple things. Like, you certainly have to try to avoid you have to think about what if the thing that you're building can be maintained over its life cycle. So I think, especially in any part of IT, developers see problems and they know how to solve them in ways that other people don't know how to solve the same problem. That's really exciting. That's why a lot of people get into the developer role. But you're not doing the business a favor if you build a little bit of it and then it sits there on the shelf for 3 to 4 years because you didn't have the capacity to finish it, right? Like,
Right.
so I think you really have to it feels cruel sometimes, to be honest, to be like, I know we could fix this thing, I get it, but I don't know that we can like own it over that life cycle. And so that's a really tough thing, to sort of deal with. The other thing that I would say is that not all technical debt is bad. So, I think that
Explain
there's
that. Yeah, I'm curious to hear how not all technical debt is bad.
Yeah, I'm not very popular for saying this. However, so my thought here is that, like, if you're a household, you can probably run your household without, going into a debt. If you're a small business or a startup, you have to take on some debt to sort of, continue to grow. And then as you pay that off, you hopefully have made more, and then you can reinvest in yourself and you can reinvest in yourself. And so there's times that we could solve the problem very elegantly the right way, and we could all retire in 5 years, and 10 years after that, maybe if we're still answering the same problems as a business, we could still use that thing. The thing is that a lot of times in data, once you answer the question once, you may not have to ever answer it again, right? Especially because now you solve that problem now, like it's gone. And so not everything, there are times that you need those durable forever types of solutions. If you're building a self-service suite of semantic models, it's pretty important to get it right and have those last more than like a year. But sometimes you just need to be able to answer that one question. And what you'll find is, let's say you do, I don't know, 5 things and then 4 of them end up not having the value that we expected or being needed, or maybe they're only used for a year because something's changing with tariffs or, the environment. That's
Right.
a short-term problem. That one that later you have to go do the right way, that's evergreen, that was built kind of just, it just did the job, but it wasn't fully integrated, like whatever. Later going and taking that one and putting it into production the right way was probably better than building all five of those the right way to begin with, and then four of them didn't get used a year or two later. So I think you have to just be like, you have to find the right balance of, you can't let it grow too much. You can't take on too much technical debt. But there's a time and a place where it actually helps, and where trying to do everything perfectly is like going to be where you just don't get as much done and you miss the opportunities to provide value.
Right. And so also like when you're building in that nimble structure, you design things in such a way that it can be scaled easier into the future without having to go and kind of do that full like waterfall build out where you do everything. So kind of like almost like using like a inbound data warehousing versus a Kimball. Like if you're gonna do inbound, it's a huge, large build out. If you're gonna do something where you can stand up a data mart super quick for XYZ utility, but you design things in such a way that you know that, hey, look, if this becomes a fan favorite, right, it creates and
Yeah,
cultivates a huge volume of value, that you didn't like sandbag yourself in the design for future reconfiguration.
exactly. Exactly. Or, let's say you're showing the results of a data science model to the person who helped you build it on the business side. They know what all that data means. You can slap that together and be like, this is how it's performing. If the CEO wants to look at it, they're not going to know what any of that stuff means. You have to put like a better bow on it. But like if you're over engineering it, if you are just trying to show it to the person and they're going to tell you to make a bunch of changes, to the model based on the results, it's like, who are you building it for, and what level does it need to be at? Does it need to be 100% or does it need to be 80%? So having that awareness.
Yeah, and I think that self-aware reality of being able to know when enough is enough, and knowing and like being able to anticipate even adoption, right? So I think that's part of like the key factor there is like working with your business partners and knowing like, are they going to actually adopt this? And is this that long term build, or is this? And I hate to say that there are certain business partners where on the front end, if I build you this, you're going to be a thorn in my side. Like they'll ask for this small thing, knowing that they're going to scope creep you for the next like 6 months,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to be like discerning as to how to like identify those characters. I feel like there should be like a good book written on like a seven dwarfs type of thing, but it like describes like the business user and how you can anticipate like what you're going to get from an adoption perspective to curb your expectations of like, okay, am I going to put in this effort and then it's going to be like a slow draw scope creep, or is this going to be a person who's like, they're going to ask for it, and then you're going to build it out. You spend 2 3 weeks, and then you're like, hey, are you using this? And like, oh yeah, I totally put it in that presentation. And what about using it in the future? Oh no, 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 that was just for the board of directors that one time. You're like, whoa, that's not what we communicated on the front end. So
Yep.
getting that sentiment of like who is your business user, I think is also just critically important to being able to evaluate the depth effort you drive towards an initiative and how like
Yeah.
robust or complete you do that initiative.
Yeah. And we modify our processes based on like what we've learned in the past, right? So like some areas, whether it's because of the partner or because of just the level of maturity that they had, sort of established before we started, behind us before we started working on things, they're further along, or they're still in this like build mode. So some areas we might go heavier on wireframes, we might go heavier on like working mock-ups where we take the last 60 days of data and we reload it every so often, and you can work with it before we sort of go do the full shebang. And then in other areas it doesn't have to work that way, so you just sort of modify based on what you learn in those cycles.
Well, this has been awesome. Do you have any final thoughts that you might be able to provide our listeners in this in the in the general conversation that of having a value centric data team and operating at scale?
I mean, the only thing that I would say, and I think I said this at the beginning, is, it's easy to read white papers or case studies or go to conferences, and it sounds like everyone has it down and it's only hard for you in your organization. Like it, it rarely looks like what it sounds like in practice, right? So I think it's just sticking with the work and always trying to get incrementally better and finding new ways, to sort of, and new techniques to do things. I think that's what really helps you to improve is just, having a learning mindset, being willing to start someplace and, recognizing that it's a journey. So I would just say stick with it. If you're somewhere in the middle of, this and talk to other people in data. I mean, and ask how they're doing it because everyone has had different things that work and what works at one company may not work at another company, right? It's not a one size fits all.
Completely
So we're
agree.
all invent.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think the big driving factor of that is the people, right?
Right.
Whether that be the people in your lateral, right? Like the people you're working with, people over you, and their directives and direction, and the infrastructure that you're operating within, and then the business partners. Who are the people that you're working with? It's going to be a dramatically different play, and how willing to work with you they are is going to be. So I completely agree. Like each organization brings about its own problems to share. So
Yeah.
so Jolie, thank you so much for joining us, and just looking forward to the next one.
Yeah. Thank you.